made sense in my case to flip the entire course. In fact, I could have flipped only a part of it, but well, I'm teaching mathematics and I thought, if I go for it, let's go for it completely. So I just changed everything and there I am. So what I wanted to do with my class time and the way I reorganized it is to ensure having a lot of time to discuss with the students. The main point for my lectures is that mathematics is not a spectator sport. So I wanted the students to be active and I wanted to be able to discuss with them as a trainer who coaches some people who are practicing sport. So what I wanted to do is really make sure that they would have a lot of questions and they would have a lot of reasons for soliciting my help. I wanted students to do a lot of exercises during the sessions and also to ask a lot of questions. So I designed 2 activities to this end. The first activity was to have them ask questions at the beginning of the session about the material they read for the coming lecture. So they had to read some material in advance, giving a lot of definitions, theorem, important results, propositions, whatever. And a material which sometimes was written in a very dry way. So they had to read everything, think about how things can be organized, and then maybe ask questions about some precise part of the material or about the general organization. So that was the first activity to really start up some discussion between me and them. The second activity to have students ask questions and really do exercises was to give them a list of exercises. So they would sit around in groups of 3 or 4 and they would try out the exercises. Sometimes the questions would be asked in a somewhat cumbersome way, which was designed to have them think about what is really difficult to prove and how they should prove them and is there really a difficulty in the first place. And then I would circulate in between them and just be ready for any questions they would have related to the exercise or some other question on material they would have seen in the previous lecture. There were 2 ways in which I checked that everyone had read the material and checked the elements I gave for one session. The first one is a very, one which students do not like very much, is that I had them write some little quizzes about give the definition of or what is a theorem about. So those quizzes would last 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning of, say, every second lecture in average, because of course it was randomly done so that students could not be sure that a quiz would happen that day or the other one. So that's something which is somewhat childish, because students don't want to be tested like that every lecture, but that's the only way I found for them to really make sure that they would read the material. So except for that sad way of checking that they were really looking into the material, there is also a more informal way which would be simply to discuss with them during the exercise session and check whether they really had understood that notion or this other one and whether they understood the corrections from the previous week. Because usually in a mathematics lectures, you build on the knowledge of the previous lectures, and so if you haven't really mastered the content of the previous lecture, then it really pops out in a discussion. The online environment I used was very basic. It was actually just a link on my web page to the correction of the exercises from one week to the other. And so the students just had to go to that URL, download the PDF and then watch the corrections. I was in fact the only one involved in that experiment. But after that, I trained other people in doing that. My teaching time between 2 sessions is in fact quite low, so I can measure it very precisely. It only consists in uploading the corrections of the exercises from past week and maybe correcting a few things in the lecture notes. So my teaching time outside the courses is really more in the design phase, when I write out the document where all the exercises are. So that can take a few weeks when you start from a standard lecture material, so lecture notes, a few exercises there, proofs of the main theorems and so on. Turning a proof of a theorem into an exercise requires some work, because you really have to think about the key essential steps and how you would formulate that into a question so that it can be answered in a few logical elements by the students. So the first reaction of the students to the teaching style is that they are a bit surprised, because usually it's the mathematics teachers doing the show, presenting all the definition, and then at some point you give an exercise, and that's a moment when a student takes a break and say, oh, I don't have to write, let's chill out for a moment. So the first reaction to the new teaching experience was really a thought like, hey, I really have to do exercises and have to do them now, and if I don't do anything, I will have to do everything at home. So some of them really were very enthusiastic about starting the exercises, having a lot of questions, soliciting my help, and some other ones just get bored and don't do very much in the first sessions. And so usually, well, the hope is that those students soon realize that they ought to work more during the session, and so they would work less at home, and really they would benefit from my help in understanding the material. I decided to flip because I was fed up that students were too passive in my lectures. The way I taught before is that I would present the whole material on the board, just give the definitions, the theorems, comment about the use of the theorems, do the proofs, and then at some point, after 1 or 2 hours of presenting the material, we would stop and do a few exercises. The typical behavior of the students would be that they would try to write down everything as fast as possible while I would be presenting the material, not very rigorously listening to the comments, and when the exercise time would come, they would just put the pen down and wait for the answer because they were a bit tired as well. I really expected students to be active in this method. I really wanted them to try the exercise, make a lot of mistakes, ask a lot of questions, because that's the only way I can really interact with them and have them realize that something is difficult, something is wrong, something is true. During design phase, the one thing which was quite difficult for me to consider was how much time would one exercise take to an average student. For me now, I know the exercises very well, the answers are very clear, and sometimes I don't even have to think about the answer. And so it's always refreshing to see how long it can take to one student to answer one question, and also see how different it can be from one student to the other, the time it takes to answer to one of those questions. So it's very difficult to have, say, an average time per question quite correct before having really seen the students at work on these questions. During the course itself, one thing is particularly difficult to manage is to keep the interest of the students high at the end of the exercise session. The typical behavior is that for the first hour, maybe the first 2 hours, students are quite motivated, they try out a lot of things for the exercises, but in the last hour of teaching, they are usually a bit tired and they give up more easily, and they sometimes don't even have the strength to ask questions. So I really have to stimulate them into trying out a few things, still asking questions even if they're a little bit tired. The first evidence that flipping would enhance learning was the students would actually be forced to do the exercises. So they would do mistakes, and I would precisely see where and when they do mistakes, and I would be able to give them some dedicated advice or question of comments about why that was wrong or why that was true. The second evidence that flipping would enhance teaching this time is that my mood would improve, because I wouldn't be in front of rows of passive students, but I would actually be discussing with human beings passionate about finding the solution to the exercises. And improving the teacher's mood definitely helps in improving the teaching experience for the student as well. There was one clear observational data which motivated me for flipping the class, is that I was teaching rows of very passive students who would sometimes take notes, sometimes try the exercises, but most of the time they would wait for me to just go on lecturing, and when I would make mistakes on the board, which happens sometimes, they would just wait for me to correct my mistakes and then wouldn't help me. The second concrete data which I had were the grades at the exams, and in fact the content of the solutions to the exams. I often realized at the very end of the lectures that students would make mistakes I never anticipated, because I thought they really had understood that point, but in fact they didn't, and I never really had the chance to realize they didn't understand the point. I did not check the literature review, I just felt I had to do it. The only article I read about flipped classroom before starting my experience was one written by a French applied mathematician in the French Applied Mathematicians Journal. And the researcher was describing his teaching experience in an engineering school about some mathematics lecture at the third year of teaching. So that's really the article which gave me the motivation for turning my standard lecture into flipped lectures. And this article also gave a few guidelines about how to do that in practice, really for the specific mathematics lecture, about how you start from a theorem and you transform the proof into a series of questions which can be done by groups of students. I haven't been trained in flipped learning, I just learned while I was doing it. I find it very important to communicate to the students why I decided to go to flipped classroom, because it's something that is quite unusual to us, at least in our institution. The way I proceed is that at the very first hour of the very first lecture, I hand them a written document with all the rules of the lectures and a dedicated paragraph in particular about why I decided to change and what are the usual complaints about this new teaching model. And they have to read the document, and then they realize why I decided to change, and I explained that I was fed up with teaching to passive students and they need to be active and so on. And in the second part of the paragraph, they read that usually students complain about the fact that there is no structured lecture on the board and so on, but I know that they have these complaints, and that's just the way it will be, and that's part of the new teaching experience. At the end of the lecture, the students were in fact very happy with the new teaching model. They were even so happy that they asked other teachers to really use that model as well. My feeling is that they were happy because they really had to try out exercises, they really had a lot of opportunities to test out the understanding of the lecturing material. And I also gave them a lot of feedback on whether they were writing things out correctly or not. And so that tremendously helped them passing the exam, I think. There were two sets of data I was collecting to check whether flipped classroom made sense for me and my students. The first set of data were the notes at the final exam. In average, the grades were more or less the same as the previous years, maybe more condensed about the average. But what was really different was my feeling when correcting the exams. I really had a happier correction time because I was seeing less outrageous mistakes than usually. The second set of data I had was more informal. It was more some communication flow between me and the students in the form of emails during the week or the weekends and questions before or after the lecturing time. This I could really realize that I had much more interaction with the students than usual. My overall evaluation of the flipped classroom experience is so good that I decided to turn one of the compulsory lectures for first-year students in our engineering school to a series of flipped classroom. So I would do sometimes some general lecture for all the students, there are 140, but otherwise all the students would be separated in 6 or 7 classes with one teacher each, and they would do flipped classrooms in those subgroups or 20 or 24 students. The very important advice I have for successful flipped classroom is to have a successful first session. And to have a successful first version, I really recommend writing out a syllabus with all the details of the lectures written in it. And then to hand it to the students in the first hour of the lecture and have them read everything carefully. To make sure that students read carefully, I put them into groups of 4. I ask them to read the document and to prepare 1 or 2 questions, like trick questions about fine details of how the lectures are organized, or spontaneous questions they have because something is not clear. And then I have students from one group asking questions to students of the other group. That way also it immediately starts up a dialogue between students and between me and the students. Concretely, the syllabus is organized in 6 parts. The first part of the syllabus just recalls the scientific scope of the lectures, what are the general aims of what they're going to learn with me. The second part of the syllabus is how the lectures are organized, what they have to do from one week to the other, where they can find the material online. The third part is how to contact me or the other teachers. So I give my email address, my office number, I ask them to send me an email before popping into my office and so on. The fourth part of the syllabus is how the final exam is organized and how sometimes also the mid-exams are organized. What kind of document they can have for the exam, what they should learn for the exams and so on. The fifth part of the syllabus motivates why I resorted to flipped classrooms and tells them what the new teaching experience will be. The sixth part of the syllabus, the last one and maybe the most important one, gives a very detailed account of how every session will be organized. So in my case, it describes what they have to read for this session, what are the exercises we are going to do during the session time, and a list also of exercises which they can do after the session time at home and ask me questions about the next time.